We're going to hand over to Nick Hepworth now from Water Witness International to give us a little bit more of an overview to bubble up some of the lessons from these different cases.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to Yola, Pendo, and Lucian for providing some really useful examples from the field to kick us off. What unites the approaches we've heard about is social accountability, the proactive engagement of citizens and civil society in exacting accountability through the monitoring of institutional performance and the open deliberation of that performance in the public domain. Social accountability is about using people power to try and address the political economy barriers to progress in the sector. It's about bridging the gap between states and citizens to try and drive responsive and better governance. And put simply, it's about speaking truth to power to drive change and challenge the status quo. Now, there's no doubt at all that the status quo on water needs to be challenged. Despite arguable success in delivering the MDGs and mobilizing the resources, the reform and the investment required, we failed to deliver where need is greatest, and striking inequalities in provision persist around the world. Despite a global commitment to implement integrated water resource management in Johannesburg in 2002, 14 years later, only 1 in 3 countries have applied the approach. Now, the gloomy metrics of these failures are reflected in the fact that 80% of the world's wastewater remains untreated, the health of freshwater ecosystems is plummeting, we've got the rising impact of water-related disasters, and water crises have been elevated to be one of the main risks facing global economic progress. At the same time, we lose about 10% of investment in the sector per year to corruption. So if we think about policy, legal reform, capacity investment as the vehicle through which we address these challenges, then social accountability can be the fuel in the engine. What I'm going to do in my presentation is to explore the conceptual groundings of social accountability, explain how it's supposed to work, and then draw on evidence from the water sector and beyond in order to flush out understanding about its potential on water and some of the key outstanding questions. Now, the ideas behind social accountability are not new. Participation, transparency, inclusion, integrity, rights-based approaches, they've been around for years. What is new is the systematic engagement of civil society and citizens to monitor performance and make these ideas real. The image here tries to represent the processes at play. Oh, here we go. So the idea is that empowered citizens can claim and monitor their rights and access to resources and tenure in order to meaningfully engage in demanding and participating in better governance. And what we've got over here are duty bearers in government who've got new information and new incentives to improve service delivery, access to governance, resources and information, which feeds back into a virtuous cycle of improved service delivery, empowered citizens and better governance. That's the idea. Now, the toolbox available for social accountability is diverse. We've got what you might call supply-side approaches here, so state-led or state-managed information dissemination systems, public grievance and complaint mechanisms, invited spaces where citizens and stakeholders can engage and debate. Up here you've got things like citizen report cards, community scorecards, social audit, participatory budget processes, PETs, public hearings, advocacy, and freedom of information campaigns. That's not an exhaustive list, but it just gives an idea of the diversity. This slide, this image, tries to represent the potential that social accountability offers to the sector. If we can get rigorous monitoring of what's happening on the ground by citizens and civil society, and draw from that monitoring evidence about what needs to change and why, to increase the impactfulness of advocacy, we can drive improved implementation of commitments and policy and agreements and law, from the local level right through to the international level. Yeah. Now, the processes at play in social accountability are complex, they're not linear, they're interlinked with lots of feedback mechanisms. So rather than presenting a spaghetti theory of change, I've tried to represent the theory of change in this cycle. Yeah. So let's use the example of our small-scale irrigator in Tanzania to illustrate the theory of change around social accountability monitoring. So this chap here relies on water for his livelihoods. He irrigates a small patch of land, but he has no knowledge of the value of a water permit and its role in securing and protecting his access to the water he needs in times of drought, in conflict, if there's a water grab by an investor, or in times of drought when uses and allocation are scaled back. So by working with him to help him understand the value of having a legal entitlement for his water, and helping him understand the processes through which he can get one from government, his capacity, his agency, his capability to act is improved. Let's say he takes the step to apply for a water use permit. What we're pushing there is new state-citizen interaction. Yeah? And here, action research is really important for social accountability. So the idea is that by tracking the response of government, we can understand how the process is working, if the system is working effectively, and identifying bottlenecks. So the idea is that we see, so let's say that he applies for the permit, he doesn't get it, and it's revealed that the basin authority responsible for processing the license doesn't have the resources or the budget to do that work. So based on that evidence, the farmer and his civil society supporters can go to government and advocate for change, enhancing dialogue and strengthening those bargaining processes. Yeah, advocating based on the evidence that the system needs to work, it's not working, it needs to work, and these are the problems that are faced. Let's say that that permit is then issued. I was told I had 1 minute left, but the time is mixed up. Wow, that's a relief. Let's say that that permit is issued, and let's say that based on that evidence, the government allocates new resources across the board to make the permitting system work. And through that, through the permit in hand, there's new trust amongst the farmer and his cohorts that the system is worth engaging with. And this new investment means that there's legitimacy for the institution more widely. And then that leads to outward learning about the value of the institution and the value of social accountability for all stakeholders, which then feeds into a new cycle of increased knowledge, action, learning and change, on and on to improve the system. Now this example's drawn from a real example in Tanzania through Pendo's work, but it could equally be sanitation in Dakar, it could be water point maintenance in Nepal, it could be the enforcement of development safeguards and impact assessments in Peru. What's happening, and the outcomes are twofold, sorry. We're looking for material change in the water security of citizens, so better services, better water access, cleaner water. And we're looking for system change within the institutions responsible for water management, so that there's benefit more widely. With the result of greater water security across the board for poverty reduction and sustainable economic growth, with the added benefits of improved service delivery, citizen empowerment and better governance. And within better governance, we include a reduction in corruption. Now, there was some debate about whether this should be a whirlwind of change, but we opted for an ice cream cone of change so that it would stick in your memories, because everybody likes an ice cream. So the big question is, does it work? Does it work? Well, there's a growing amount of literature out there that applies systematic review and meta-analysis to see if social accountability works. It's been applied for many years in the education sector, in the health sector. The conclusion is that it depends. It depends. It depends on how well those social accountability approaches are matched to the context within which it's applied. You know, the success is dependent on the willingness, ability, and the readiness of citizens, civil society, and government to engage in this process. And that can't always be assumed. And there are spaces that are needed to engage in that process. It also depends on how strategic these approaches are. At the outset, during the first wave of social accountability, it was assumed that if you create a storm of information and give everybody an iPhone to record what's going on, that would be enough to drive change. And that's since been proved to be a little bit naive. And the conclusion is that strategies which combine support for citizen voice and at the same time support for government to respond to that voice are much more likely to succeed. Let's be under no illusions. You know, social accountability is a highly political process. Yeah? It's about challenging government. It's about challenging the status quo. So the political risks at stake need to be understood, and measures need to be in place to manage those risks. So, for example, you know, capture of the process by local elites, contribution to local conflict. This could easily be seen to be raising a mob. The issue of donor-led social accountability crowding out or delegitimizing more legitimate local action. A whole bunch of political risks which need to be managed. The fourth point is that, as Pendo alluded to and others, the data generated needs to be reliable, it needs to be objective, it needs to be dependable. So the methodology used needs to be sound. These approaches also need to be adaptive. There's no way of predicting what social accountability work is going to lead to, and therefore the interventions need to be cognizant of that and able to be a bit flexible to respond to the changes that are brought. Approaches also need to be, maybe not need to be, but there's evidence that constructive approaches are more impactful. You can easily imagine that approaches that accuse people directly of being corrupt, lazy, incompetent, will quickly lead to conflict of people being closed down. These approaches also need to be collaborative. You can imagine the chaos that would happen if there were 4 different social accountability initiatives working on the same topics with the same people in the same place. Carnage. Fifth point is that there are big challenges in defining what success looks like and then measuring that success. You know, the change that these processes drive occur along long and twisting channels of change, yeah, which don't lend themselves to the straitjacket of logical framework approaches and quantifiable results. So we need to get much better at defining impact, at measuring and evaluating it, and again, attributing impact. I think Yolo and others mentioned that, impact attribution. As our contributors mentioned, these are long-term processes. Yeah? They need long-term investment to enable civil society to do the difficult job of holding people to account. So extended interaction is needed. Now there's a problem here. First, the space within which civil society can operate is closing down. In the past 10 years, 50 governments around the world have passed new law to restrict the voice and freedoms of civil society. There's also a current dearth of the long-term funding, programmatic funding, which civil society needs to deliver this work. So, in conclusion, although simple replication holds risks, it seems that there is potential for social accountability to make a major contribution. And I think the water sector is particularly well placed because for years we've been investing in multi-stakeholder platforms, dialogue processes, so we don't have to build those from the ground up. What social accountability can do is equip those actors and those processes with reliable and hard-hitting evidence of how things are happening out there in the real world, to enable them to be more productive and more impactful. Practice to date from our examples, and some of them have been externally evaluated to verify the impact, suggests that they work. Albeit they need to continue, they work. And that they work quite cheaply, comparatively, so they're good value for money. So that might call for a focus on strengthening to ensure that the advocacy generated has clout broadening out the work to ensure that there are more beneficiaries and stronger representation and legitimacy, and supporting all actors on all sides so that they've got the capacity to engage in these processes in the long term. So, of course, learning has got to be at the centre of all this. Yeah? And that's why we want your thoughts on this proposition. Yeah? Some people could argue that it's investment that's the key, it's infrastructure, it's more capacity, it's reform, more ice cream. But we're going to argue, or we argue, that social accountability can lever all of those things. You know, if there's not enough investment, social accountability can lever that. If there's not enough infrastructure, it's not maintained, social accountability can lever that. If there's not enough capacity, or the law's wrong, social accountability can lever on that. So we think that social accountability is the key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 6 by 2030. There are a couple of key points and key questions and controversies that we want to explore. The first of all is that it's very clear that social accountability will require new roles and new relationships and will challenge existing relationships. So, for example, NGOs might need to move away from being implementing partners on infrastructure towards the facilitation of oversight mechanisms. Communities might need to move away from being passive beneficiaries to active and critical watchdogs. And governments are going to need to move from being masters of processes to being equal partners. So there's inevitably going to be challenge and conflict of interest in that. So we need to understand what those are and how we can deal with them. And secondly is this point of, you know, how do we nurture and support effective social accountability practice? There's a hazard, there's a real risk that this suffers from uncoordinated evolution and the issue of being donor-led and donor imposition of priorities. Yeah, we need to avoid that, and we need to nurture the emerging field of practice with new ways of doing monitoring, evaluation and learning, etc. So these are the big questions that we think are emerging from the literature. They're reflected, and there's more detail on those in the paper that's on all your table, and it would be great to get your feedback on those at a later date. What we want to do now is to dive in and get your thoughts on these two questions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ken.